One live broadcast, one unnoticed hazard, one split second where everything goes wrong. That's all it takes to turn 5 ordinary people doing their jobs into the most disturbing deaths ever captured on camera. Their final moments prove that no amount of preparation can predict when routine turns fatal, and thousands of viewers witness it unfold in real time. It was November 26, 2015, in downtown St. Louis, Missouri. The morning air carried a damp chill, typical for late autumn in the Midwest. Overcast skies hung low over the staging area where parade floats lined up along a wide commercial street. The pavement glistened from earlier drizzle, and the faint smell of diesel exhaust mixed with the scent of wet asphalt. Crowds had already begun gathering behind metal barricades, bundled in coats and scarves, waiting for the Thanksgiving Day parade to begin. Camera crews positioned themselves at key intersections, preparing for the live broadcast that would reach thousands of households across the region. Elias Beck was 34 years old, a municipal maintenance contractor who was assigned to high-visibility events because he knew how to keep things moving. Parade mornings ran on tight timelines, and delays reflected directly on the ground crew. That day, his role was to serve as safety marshal in the float staging area, signaling operators, watching clearances, and making sure vehicles stopped where they were supposed to. He wore a reflective vest over his work jacket and carried a 2-way radio clipped to his belt. The staging zone sat on a slight downhill grade, roughly 2%, barely noticeable to the eye but enough to matter under certain conditions. Earlier that morning, a scheduling delay had pushed back the lineup by nearly 20 minutes. Floats that should have been secured and stationary were still being repositioned. Wheel chocks, normally placed immediately after parking, had been removed prematurely from several vehicles to allow for last-minute adjustments. One of the larger floats, a steel-framed structure weighing several tons, idled near the rear of the formation. Its engine rumbled steadily, vibrating through the chassis and into the damp pavement below. Elias stood directly behind it, facing the driver's side mirror, preparing to signal a full stop before the broadcast went live. The float began to roll backward. It happened slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, as the engine vibration and slope combined with a parking brake that had not been fully engaged and a transmission left in neutral to overcome the vehicle's hold on the wet surface. Elias noticed the movement and raised his hand, stepping closer to signal the driver. The rear axle struck him at knee height before he could move clear. Both legs fractured on impact, buckling beneath him as he fell backward onto the pavement. The rear frame continued its rearward drift, and the differential housing, a heavy cast-iron component mounted low on the undercarriage, came down across his chest and abdomen. The weight was immediate and total. Severe thoracic compression from the float's weight prevented lung expansion and effective respiration. Witnesses standing near the barricades saw him become pinned beneath the float's rear section. The vehicle continued rolling another few feet before its front wheels struck the metal barricade, finally bringing it to a stop. Elias's boots remained visible beneath the frame, motionless. Operators shouted to kill the engines. The live camera feed, already rolling during parade coverage, showed crew members moving rapidly toward the float before the broadcast cut away. Elias lost the ability to breathe almost immediately and became unresponsive shortly afterward. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but were unable to access him until the float was carefully repositioned using a tow vehicle. By the time they reached him, there was no pulse and no respiration. The official cause of death was traumatic crush injuries resulting in respiratory failure. His chest cavity had been compressed beyond the point of recovery, and internal bleeding was extensive. The parade was halted, and the live broadcast cut to a standby screen after several seconds of unscheduled interruption. The staging area was sealed off as investigators documented the scene, measuring the grade of the roadway and examining the float's braking system. The float remained stationary over his body until emergency personnel could safely move it. Elias Beck was pronounced dead at the scene, his reflective vest still visible beneath the steel frame. While parade organizers reviewed their staging protocols in Missouri, television crews in Phoenix prepared for a different kind of live segment. Among them was Tamsin Gray, a passionate advocate who had spent years working to make city streets safer for pedestrians. It was May 9, 2016, in Phoenix, Arizona. Afternoon temperatures reached the low 90s as traffic moved steadily through a busy commercial corridor. A local news crew was already live at a major intersection, filming from a narrow painted median left little separation from passing vehicles. Tamsin Gray was 29 years old, a community outreach coordinator who often agreed to live interviews because visibility mattered to her work. She believed showing conditions on site made safety issues harder to ignore, even when the setting itself carried risk. That afternoon segment focused on recent pedestrian fatalities and the city's failure to protect people at busy intersections. The interview location had been selected specifically for its visibility, positioned where viewers could see active traffic in the background. What it offered in visual impact, it lacked in practical safety. The median strip where Tamsin stood measured less than 4 feet wide, bordered on both sides by active travel lanes. The camera operator positioned himself close to the roadway edge, framing the shot to capture both Tamsin and the flowing traffic behind her. No physical barriers separated them from the vehicles passing just feet away. Traffic moved at posted speeds of 35 miles per hour, though some vehicles exceeded that limit. The interview began without incident, Tamsin gesturing toward the intersection as she explained the need for better pedestrian protections. Vehicle noise created a constant backdrop, requiring her to speak louder than normal. The crew had conducted similar roadside segments before without issue, and the familiarity bred a certain comfort with the inherent risks. A pickup truck drifted across the lane line. Witnesses later reported that the driver appeared to be reaching for something on the passenger seat, causing a momentary loss of attention. The vehicle's extended towing mirror clipped her shoulder, snapping her upper body sideways and driving her head into its path as it passed. The impact spun her off the narrow median and into the adjacent traffic lane. She fell hard onto the asphalt, disoriented and unable to regain her footing. Seconds later, a sedan traveling in the same direction entered the intersection. The driver had no time to react. The front bumper struck her pelvis and torso at approximately 40 miles per hour, the force throwing her body several feet forward before she came to rest on the pavement. Her head struck the concrete curb with significant force. Witnesses standing at the corner saw her body go still immediately after the second impact. The camera operator dropped his equipment as the live feed cut abruptly, then rushed toward her shouting for someone to call emergency services. Traffic in both directions came to a halt as bystanders moved to block the lanes. Blood began seeping beneath her head where the skull had fractured against the curb edge. She showed no signs of movement or respiration. Drivers exited their vehicles, some attempting to provide assistance while others directed traffic away from the scene. Emergency responders arrived within 6 minutes of the initial call. Paramedics found her unresponsive with agonal respirations and a rapidly fading pulse. Resuscitation attempts were made at the scene, but proved unsuccessful. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma resulting in catastrophic head injury, compounded by internal injuries sustained from the vehicle impact. The intersection was sealed off for nearly 3 hours as investigators documented the scene, measuring skid marks and interviewing witnesses. The camera equipment remained where it had fallen, continuing to record audio and partial visuals after the live broadcast was interrupted until the battery died. Both drivers involved remained at the scene and cooperated fully with the investigation. Tamsin Gray was pronounced dead at the scene, her body covered with a tarp until the medical examiner arrived. The live segment she had been filming, intended to prevent pedestrian deaths, instead became part of the evidence reviewed during the investigation. As Phoenix mourned the loss of an advocate killed by the dangers she fought to eliminate, tornado season intensified across Kansas. Weather technician Dorian Marsh had spent years capturing nature's most volatile moments with broadcast crews. It was June 3rd, 2017, outside Wichita, Kansas. A tornado watch was in effect as green-gray skies and strengthening winds swept the area. Gusts exceeded 50 miles per hour, while local television crews broadcast live from rural highway shoulders, tracking rapidly deteriorating storm conditions west of the city. Dorian Marsh was 41 years old, a freelance weather technician who took high-risk storm assignments because they paid more and led to repeat contracts. Severe weather days were when technicians proved their value. That afternoon, his job was to keep a temporary steel radar mast stable long enough for the live broadcast to continue, even as wind speeds began exceeding safe setup limits. The mast stood approximately 25 feet tall, constructed from tubular steel sections that connected at reinforced joints. It swayed visibly in the gusting wind, the movement becoming more pronounced as conditions worsened. Base anchors had been driven into the gravel earlier, but adjustments were needed as wind speeds exceeded initial forecasts. The broadcast schedule left little time for modifications, and the decision was made to proceed with coverage while making incremental improvements to the anchoring system. Dorian worked at the base of the mast, tightening guy wire connections and repositioning stakes to improve stability. The live camera feed shook intermittently as gusts hit the structure. The on-air meteorologist, positioned near the vehicle, urged the crew to wrap up the segment as wind speeds continued climbing. Debris began moving across the highway, small branches and loose gravel skittering past the equipment. The mast's upper section oscillated in a widening arc, the joints creaking audibly under the stress. Dorian remained focused on the anchoring work, his back to the wind, attempting to secure the base before the next transmission. A sudden gust, estimated later at 65 miles per hour, struck the mast from the side. The upper joint, already stressed from repeated flexing, failed catastrophically. The steel section buckled, and the top 15 feet of the structure collapsed downward and sideways. Viewers briefly saw the camera drop and the image break up before the broadcast was taken off air. The falling frame struck Dorian across his upper back and neck with the full weight of the steel assembly. The impact drove him forward onto the gravel, his thoracic spine fracturing instantly at multiple points. Severe internal injuries resulted as the mast came to rest across his torso, pinning him face down against the roadside shoulder. Crew members witnessed the collapse as the live feed jolted violently before cutting away. The mast section, weighing several hundred pounds, lay across his body from shoulder blades to lower back. They attempted to lift the steel frame, but found it difficult to maneuver without causing further injury. Dorian showed no movement and no response to verbal calls. His position, face down with the weight distributed across his spine, prevented any visible breathing motion. One crew member called emergency services, while others worked to carefully shift the mast off his body. By the time they succeeded in removing the steel frame, several minutes had passed. No pulse could be detected. Emergency responders arrived approximately 12 minutes after the initial call, delayed slightly by the deteriorating weather conditions and rural location. The official cause of death was determined to be a catastrophic spinal fracture with massive internal trauma resulting from the impact of the collapsing mast. The force caused catastrophic fractures to the upper thoracic spine with secondary cervical involvement, leading to immediate respiratory arrest. The live broadcast footage was later reviewed by investigators examining equipment safety protocols. Dorian Marsh was pronounced dead at the scene, his body remaining on the gravel shoulder until the medical examiner arrived nearly an hour later as the storm system moved east. The collapsed mast lay beside him, its failed joint clearly visible. 2 more disturbing live broadcast moments are still ahead. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. It was October 18th, 2017, inside a courthouse in Texas. Routine proceedings continued under fluorescent lights as a fixed courtroom camera transmitted the session live through a public access broadcast. Nothing initially set the day apart from any other on the docket. Cleo Banks was 52 years old, a civil defendant in a property dispute that had dragged on for nearly 18 months. 2 weeks earlier, she had asked the court for a medical delay, citing uncontrolled blood pressure and recurring severe headaches. The motion was denied due to previous continuances. She had worked in retail management before health issues forced an early retirement 3 years earlier. Those close to her knew she struggled with untreated hypertension, managing it inconsistently due to financial constraints and a distrust of medical intervention. That morning, she appeared in court anyway, seated at the defense table wearing a dark blazer, her posture upright but visibly tense. A court-appointed bailiff stood near the judge's bench, approximately 15 feet away. The courtroom's audio and video feed transmitted live and continuously to the public access broadcast. The judge addressed procedural matters from the bench, reviewing documents and making notations. Cleo remained seated, her hands folded on the table in front of her. Witnesses later reported that she appeared uncomfortable, but gave no verbal indication of distress. The proceedings continued without interruption for several minutes. The live camera angle captured the defense table in profile, showing Cleo's upper body and face clearly to viewers watching the public access broadcast. Without warning, while the courtroom feed aired live, Cleo's body stiffened. Her back arched slightly, and her hands gripped the edge of the table. A massive cerebral hemorrhage was later determined to have begun, blood vessels rupturing deep within her brain as pressure overwhelmed weakened arterial walls. Her face contorted briefly before her muscles lost coordination entirely. She slumped sideways in her chair, her body tilting at an awkward angle before gravity pulled her completely off the seat. She fell to the left, her head striking the sharp corner of the defense table before impacting the concrete floor. The impact was audible throughout the courtroom, a dull crack that caused immediate silence. Her skull likely fractured on contact, compounding the catastrophic damage already occurring inside her brain. Blood began pooling beneath her head almost immediately, spreading across the polished concrete in a dark stain. Her body convulsed involuntarily, limbs jerking in uncoordinated spasms as her nervous system misfired. The seizure activity lasted approximately 30 seconds before her body went completely still. Her eyes remained partially open, fixed and unresponsive. The bailiff moved toward her immediately, actions unfolding live on the public access broadcast as he called for medical assistance and knelt beside her. Other court personnel rushed to the scene, one attempting to check for a pulse, while another called emergency services. The judge ordered the courtroom cleared as the camera continued recording. EMTs arrived within 4 minutes. They found Cleo unresponsive with a faint, irregular pulse that rapidly deteriorated despite resuscitation efforts. Resuscitation protocols were initiated, but proved ineffective. The combination of massive internal bleeding and the secondary trauma from the fall had caused irreversible damage. Emergency responders transported Cleo Banks to a nearby hospital under critical condition. Despite aggressive intervention, she never regained consciousness. She was pronounced dead several hours later after physicians determined the extent of the cerebral hemorrhage and secondary head trauma was unsurvivable. A medical examination later confirmed the cause of death as a massive cerebral hemorrhage, with the fall inside the courtroom contributing fatal secondary injuries. Investigators noted that untreated hypertension likely weakened the blood vessels in her brain, making rupture more likely under stress. The live courtroom broadcast, which captured the collapse and emergency response, was preserved as part of the official record and later reviewed during an internal assessment of courtroom medical procedures. The civil case was formally dismissed in the days that followed, but Cleo wasn't the only one whose final moments would be captured live. In Atlantic City, Hugo Vane prepared for a live competition finale before thousands of viewers. It was August 12, 2018, inside a large entertainment venue along the Atlantic City boardwalk. Cameras were live as the finale of a nationally televised talent competition began. The stage was fitted with concealed flame jets for visual effects, with fire suppression systems zoned to activate only at extreme temperatures. Hugo Vane was 26 years old and had spent nearly a decade building toward this moment. Unlike other finalists, he wasn't chasing exposure alone. Hugo had turned down earlier touring contracts to refine a solo act that relied on timing, proximity, and controlled risk. Advancing to the finale meant visibility that could lock in a long-term residency, something producers had quietly hinted at during rehearsals. That afternoon, technical delays pushed the rehearsal schedule behind. To maintain broadcast timing, stage managers approved a late adjustment to the pyrotechnic sequence. One flame unit was repositioned slightly closer to the rear performance zone to tighten the visual framing for camera. Hugo was informed of the change but chose to proceed, believing the margin was still safe. Backing out at that stage could cost him the finale slot entirely. As the live countdown began, the audience rose to its feet. Hugo moved into position at center stage, 6 feet from the rear panel, closer than originally planned, but within the revised staging marks taped earlier that day. Behind him, flame jets armed automatically, their ignitions synced to the final musical beat. Lighting shifted to deep reds and amber tones. The music swelled. Stage crew monitored multiple cues simultaneously from the wings, their attention split across performers and broadcast timing. When the cue fired, one flame jet discharged incorrectly. Instead of projecting straight upward, the unit released a horizontal burst. Investigators would later determine the nozzle had been misaligned during recalibration, angling the flame bar toward the performance zone. Pressurized gas ignited instantly, sending fire across the stage at torso height. The flames struck Hugo's costume first. The synthetic fabric ignited immediately, fire racing across his chest and shoulders. Within seconds, the material melted and adhered to his skin, intensifying the burns. Dense black smoke rolled upward, visible on every live camera angle. Viewers watching at home saw Hugo stagger forward as flames climbed toward his neck. His airway was compromised almost instantly. Superheated air and toxic combustion gases entered his lungs, triggering rapid respiratory failure. He collapsed onto the stage floor while still burning, his movements slowing as oxygen deprivation set in. The broadcast audio captured audience screams as the live feed shook. Stage crew rushed forward with handheld extinguishers, discharging foam directly onto Hugo's body. The visible flames were suppressed, but smoke continued to rise from the charred fabric. Hugo showed no movement once the fire was out. The live broadcast cut away seconds later. On-site medical personnel reached the stage within 90 seconds. Hugo was conscious but in severe respiratory distress, struggling to breathe and coughing dark residue from his airway. Burns covered roughly 40% of his body, concentrated on the torso, neck, and upper arms. Oxygen was administered immediately as paramedics prepared him for transport. He was rushed to a regional burn center in critical condition. Doctors performed emergency intubation shortly after arrival, documenting extensive thermal damage to the upper airway and chemical injury to the lungs. Despite mechanical ventilation, his respiratory function continued to decline over the following hours as swelling and inflammation worsened, severely limiting oxygen exchange. Hugo died early the next morning from acute respiratory failure, complicated by systemic inflammatory response caused by the burns. A medical examination confirmed the cause of death as severe inhalation injury with delayed respiratory failure, with thermal burns listed as contributing factors. Investigators determined the pyrotechnic accident resulted from improper nozzle alignment during a last-minute recalibration, causing a flame jet to discharge horizontally into the performance zone. His costume fabric lacked flame retardant treatment, allowing rapid ignition and intensified smoke exposure. The competition was suspended immediately. All remaining broadcasts were canceled, and safety protocols for live pyrotechnics were later revised using the incident as a reference case. Thanks for watching. Want to see more? Click on your screen now.